the paradox of time and the human desire to change it. In the annals of science fiction, few works have captured the essence of human fragility as elegantly as Steins Gate. Beneath its surface of scientific jargon, temporal paradoxes, and conspiratorial intrigue lies a profound psychological and philosophical inquiry. Why do human beings, aware of their limitations, persist in seeking to rewrite the immutable flow of time? At its core, Steins.Gate is not a story about time travel. It is a meditation on regret, grief, and the human struggle against inevitability. It confronts a paradox that defines both science and existence, the relentless desire to alter what has already been written, the allure of the impossible. To understand Steins.Gate, one must begin with the universal desire to change the past. Every human being carries within memory a record of pain, loss, or mistake that shapes the psyche. This desire to undo what was done, to rewrite one's life, emerges not from malice, but from a longing for control in a universe that resists human command. It is, in psychological terms, an extension of counterfactual thinking, the cognitive tendency to imagine alternative outcomes to past events. If only I had. Okabe Rintaro, the central figure of Steins.Gate, embodies this impulse in its purest form. His self-styled persona as the mad scientist Hoin Kyuma is not merely an act of eccentricity, but a defense mechanism, a delusional construct that shields his fragile ego from the helplessness inherent in reality. When he first discovers that messages sent to the past can alter the present, his excitement mirrors the archetypal human response to newfound power, intoxication by the illusion of mastery. Yet, as the narrative unfolds, this illusion dissolves into a psychological descent that mirrors humanity's historical relationship with technological advancement, discovery followed by hubris, and finally, moral confrontation, the myth of control and the fear of regret. At a deeper level, Steins.Gate engages with the paradox of control. Modern psychology defines control as the belief that one's actions can influence outcomes. It is a foundational element of motivation and mental stability. However, when faced with irreversible events, death, trauma, or missed opportunities, the human mind often fails to reconcile reality with its inherent need for agency. This cognitive dissonance gives rise to regret, a form of emotional suffering that originates from an awareness of alternative possibilities that can no longer be actualized. Okabe's journey is, in essence, a psychological case study of regret magnified by temporal omnipotence. When he realizes that his actions in one world line can save Mayuri but condemn Kurisu, he experiences a phenomenon similar to what existential psychology calls the burden of infinite choice. Theoretically, the capacity to alter any event should liberate him. Instead, it enslaves him within an unending cycle of guilt and futility. This mirrors real-world findings in decision theory, where greater freedom of choice often leads to increased dissatisfaction, a paradox known as the tyranny of choice. In the context of time, the tyranny becomes unbearable. If one can endlessly change outcomes, the boundaries between cause and consequence collapse, eroding the very meaning of responsibility. Okabe's repeated attempts to manipulate time thus become both an act of defiance and a manifestation of self-destruction. The very power that once promised liberation becomes the source of his torment. Time in Steins.Gate is not merely a physical dimension, it is a psychological construct. In phenomenological terms, time exists because humans experience continuity. The past gives identity, the future gives purpose. To manipulate time, then, is to disrupt the psychological foundation of selfhood. Each alteration to the world line fractures Okabe's sense of continuity, producing cognitive dissonance and existential alienation. When the narrative forces him to remember multiple timelines that others cannot, he becomes an embodiment of temporal trauma. Each memory represents a reality that no longer exists, yet the emotional residue persists. This condition can be read as a metaphor for unresolved grief, the persistence of emotional memory after the world has moved on. It is this dissonance that drives Okabe to madness, illustrating a truth that transcends fiction, that memory once detached from linear time becomes unbearable. The scientific mirror rationalism and emotional denial. The genius of Steins.Gate lies in how it uses science not as spectacle, but as metaphor. The D-mail, the microwave, and the concept of world lines symbolize the human attempt to impose order on chaos to rationalize the irrational. Science, in this context, becomes a mirror reflecting the limits of rationalism. Okabe's early faith in logic, equations, and causality mirrors the Enlightenment belief that knowledge guarantees progress. However, as his experiments unfold, he discovers what philosophers from Nietzsche to Kierkegaard have long warned, that reason cannot conquer existential truth. No formula can calculate the emotional cost of change. No equation can quantify love, loss, or moral weight. Each scientific success thus reveals a moral failure. The closer Okabe approaches mastery over time, the more he loses his humanity. This is a recurring theme in modern existential literature, the idea that knowledge without acceptance leads not to enlightenment but to despair. Steins.Gate rearticulates this through Okabe's descent from rational scientist to broken man. Time travel introduces an ethical paradox that few narratives confront with such rigor. If one can alter events, who bears moral responsibility for the outcomes? In the Steins.Gate universe, every change reverberates across countless lives. The act of saving one person inherently condemns another. This moral structure aligns with the utilitarian dilemma, the question of whether one life is worth the cost of many. Yet Steins.Gate transcends utilitarian calculus by showing that all attempts at moral optimization through time are inherently flawed. The reason is simple yet profound. Time is not a static equation to be solved, but an organic process to be experienced. Once tampered with, it loses coherence. The pursuit of a perfect outcome negates the emotional authenticity of existence itself. Okabe's moral exhaustion, his eventual realization that no world line is free of suffering, is a reflection of this truth. The anime thereby advances an implicit argument against temporal interventionism, that moral purity cannot exist in a non-linear universe. Humanity's eternal struggle with impermanence. At its philosophical core, Steins.Gate dramatizes humanity's ancient struggle with impermanence. Across cultures and centuries, the human species has sought to resist decay, death, and time through religion, memory, or science. The time machine, then, is not merely a technological fantasy, it is a symbolic extension of humanity's denial of mortality. In this light, Okabe's journey mirrors the trajectory of human civilization itself. The more we seek to dominate nature, the more we confront our own limitations. Every act of defiance against impermanence generates new forms of suffering. Just as the alchemists once sought eternal life and found only madness, Okabe seeks a world without loss and discovers that such a world annihilates meaning, for meaning arises not from permanence but from transience, from knowing that every moment once lived cannot be reclaimed. The irony of Steins Gate, salvation through surrender. The term Steins Gate itself encapsulates the paradox of salvation through surrender. It represents not a utopian timeline, but a psychological state, a reconciliation between agency and acceptance. Okabe's eventual understanding that one cannot fix time but can only choose to accept its flow marks his transformation from delusion to wisdom. In philosophical terms, this acceptance reflects the transition from epistemic arrogance, the belief that all truths can be known and controlled, to existential humility, the recognition of one's limits. It is a journey mirrored in the philosophies of Stoicism and Zen, the understanding that peace lies not in changing the external world, but in aligning oneself with its nature. In Steins.Gate, time is both antagonist and teacher. It resists manipulation not through physical force, but through moral and psychological consequence. The more Okabe attempts to alter its flow, the more he learns that the true flaw lies not in time itself, but in the human refusal to accept it. The science of Steins.Gate between chaos and determinism. In Steins.Gate, science is not simply a backdrop or narrative device. It is the philosophical architecture that frames every moral and psychological conflict. The show's realism in portraying the mechanics of time travel, grounded in theoretical physics, yet filtered through human error, transforms abstract equations into emotional symbols. What begins as a tale of experimentation becomes an exploration of a deeper duality, chaos and determinism. Okabe Rintaro's world is one where every equation conceals a paradox, and every discovery demands a personal sacrifice. Through his descent into the labyrinth of causality, Steins.Gate dissects humanity's belief in rational control and exposes the fragility of that belief when confronted with the unpredictable nature of existence. The architecture of time from causality to chaos. The narrative of Steins.Gate is built upon one of the most complex philosophical concepts in modern science, the idea that causality, the relationship between cause and effect, may not be linear. Instead, the series postulates that every action creates ripples across an infinite set of world lines, each representing a unique configuration of reality. These world lines are separated not by distance, but by divergence, the measure of how much one reality differs from another. This framework, inspired by the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics proposed by Hugh Everett III, becomes the philosophical backbone of the story. It implies that every decision generates a new branch of existence, suggesting that the universe is not a single unfolding narrative but a multidimensional field of potentialities. However, Steins.Gate introduces a crucial twist. Despite the multiplicity of worlds, certain events seem inevitable. These attractor fields pull different world lines towards similar outcomes, such as Mayuri. Determinism as psychological prison. Determinism in philosophical discourse asserts that every event is the inevitable result of preceding causes. Within the context of Steins.Gate, this principle becomes both a scientific model and a psychological cage. The more Okabe learns about the structure of time, the less free he becomes. His capacity to observe divergence, to see that his world belongs to a certain attractor field, transforms freedom into paralysis. From a psychological standpoint, this represents the collapse of agency. Okabe's awareness of determinism mirrors the human experience of existential fatalism, the sense that one's actions, regardless of intent, cannot alter ultimate outcomes. The anime visualizes this through repetition, the constant failure to prevent Mayuri's death, despite endless variations of intervention. Each iteration erodes his sense of efficacy, leading to a form of learned helplessness. In classical psychology, this term describes a condition in which repeated exposure to uncontrollable outcomes leads to passivity and despair. Okabe's eventual breakdown is therefore not only emotional, but epistemological, a direct consequence of understanding too much about how the universe works. Here, Steins' Gate subtly critiques the Enlightenment ideal that knowledge equals power. In the realm of time, knowledge strips power away. The more Okabe learns about causality, the more he realizes that knowledge without acceptance becomes a curse. Chaos theory and the fragility of systems. While determinism governs the macrostructure of Steins' Gate, chaos defines its microstructure. Every change Okabe introduces into the timeline produces exponential and unpredictable consequences, a perfect dramatization of the butterfly effect. In chaos theory, the butterfly effect describes how small initial changes can lead to vastly different outcomes in complex systems. In the anime, a single message to the past alters personal relationships, social dynamics, and even global politics. The character's attempts to control these ripples mirror humanity's illusion of predictability in a fundamentally unstable world. This interplay between order and chaos underscores a deeper psychological insight that human cognition craves linear narratives, but reality operates through non-linear causality. From a scientific perspective, chaos theory illustrates the sensitivity of systems to initial conditions. From a philosophical perspective, it illustrates the futility of trying to master complexity through reason alone. Steins' Gate embodies both perspectives simultaneously. It shows that even in a system governed by physical laws, unpredictability reigns not because the universe is irrational, but because it exceeds the capacity of human understanding. The role of technology, the microwave as metaphor. In the material sense, Steins' Gate begins with a simple experiment, a modified microwave that sends messages to the past. However, within the narrative, this device functions as an allegorical instrument. It symbolizes humanity's technological overreach, the transformation of mundane tools into gateways to the divine. The microwave's absurdity, its crude mechanism, the accidental nature of its discovery emphasizes the irony of technological progress, that world-altering inventions often arise not from moral clarity, but from curiosity devoid of foresight. The same device that promises to fix mistakes becomes the mechanism that magnifies them. This inversion reflects a historical pattern familiar to human civilization. Every leap in technology, from nuclear energy to artificial intelligence, has carried both salvation and catastrophe. Steins' Gate mirrors this tension perfectly. It presents science as both illumination and curse, an external projection of the human psyche's internal contradictions. In psychoanalytic terms, the microwave embodies the Freudian duality of eros and thanatos, creation and destruction intertwined. The impulse to master time is, at its core, both a desire for preservation to save those we love and an unconscious flirtation with annihilation to unmake the unbearable past. The collapse of causality when logic fails. One of the most intellectually profound elements in Steins' Gate is how it portrays the breakdown of logical systems under emotional strain. As Okabe manipulates world lines, his attempts to establish stable causal relationships collapse. Events contradict themselves, outcomes repeat despite intervention. This destabilization reflects the limits of rational positivism, the belief that reality can be entirely explained through logical deduction. The anime thus reintroduces a philosophical tension that has haunted science since the dawn of modernity, the conflict between reason and uncertainty. Rationality seeks predictability, but the universe, governed by quantum indeterminacy, denies it. In Okabe's world, every attempt at calculation yields unforeseen results, rendering logic inadequate as a moral compass. This breakdown mirrors the experience of cognitive overload when an individual's conceptual frameworks cannot process the complexity of their environment. Okabe's descent into despair can therefore be interpreted as ontological collapse. His worldview no longer coheres with the structure of reality. He begins to oscillate between rational explanation and existential panic, between the scientist's objectivity and the human being's grief. By depicting the limits of logic, Steins' Gate reaffirms an ancient philosophical truth that knowledge divorced from wisdom leads not to mastery but to alienation, the observer effect and the self as variable. Another cornerstone of the series' scientific philosophy is the observer effect, the idea that the act of observation alters the observed phenomenon. In Steins' Gate, Okabe's unique ability to retain memories across timelines positions him as both observer and participant. His very consciousness becomes a variable that shapes reality. This aligns with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which posits that particles exist in a state of probability until observed. In a metaphorical sense, Okabe's awareness collapses world lines into specific outcomes. but this awareness also becomes his torment. By observing too much, he becomes burdened by realities that others cannot see. Philosophically, this condition represents the existential isolation of self-awareness. To be conscious is to be separate, to see what others cannot, to carry knowledge others are spared. Okabe's solitude, therefore, is not just narrative necessity, but existential allegory. His consciousness transcends temporal limits, yet that transcendence becomes a prison. This theme echoes the philosophical tradition of phenomenology, particularly the works of Edmund Husserl and Jean-Paul Sartre, which argue that self-awareness isolates the individual from the world. To know reality too intimately is to lose one's place within it. Thus, the more Okabe perceives time's structure, the more he becomes alienated from the world he seeks to protect. Entropy and the moral thermodynamics of time. Every system, physical or moral, is bound by the principle of entropy, the natural tendency toward disorder. Steins. Gate extends this concept from physics to ethics. Each alteration to the past increases the entropy of the moral universe. The more Okabe interferes, the less stable reality becomes. This transposition of physical law into moral philosophy is one of the series' most subtle achievements. It implies that morality, like energy, cannot be created or destroyed without cost, only transformed. To save one life is to endanger another. To restore order in one world line is to sow chaos in another. This reflects a deep existential principle that balances the fundamental law of the universe. The pursuit of perfect outcomes, whether scientific or moral, violates this equilibrium and inevitably produces suffering. Okabe's eventual realization of this truth, that every intervention carries unseen consequences, marks the beginning of his psychological evolution. Steins. Gate transforms the theoretical language of physics into a philosophical meditation on existence. Its exploration of chaos, determinism, and entropy transcends scientific realism to reveal a deeper emotional logic. Through Okabe's futile experiments, it exposes the limits of human reason, the fragility of control, and the inevitable entropy of all systems, whether physical, moral, or emotional. In doing so, it reframes the pursuit of mastery over time as a mirror of humanity's eternal paradox, our need to understand the world, and our simultaneous inability to accept its indifference. The tragedy of Steins, the gate lies not in failure, but in realization that knowledge without acceptance becomes its own kind of prison. The psychological cost of changing time. At its narrative and philosophical center, Steins' Gate is a study of the human psyche under the pressure of temporal power, of what happens when the boundaries between cause, consequence, and memory collapse. The series uses time travel not as spectacle but as psychological experiment. Its central question is not, what if we could change the past, but rather, what would such power do to the mind? The answer, as Steins' Gate reveals, is devastation. The ability to alter time is not liberation. It is psychological disintegration. Through Okabe Rintaro's descent into despair, the anime constructs one of the most profound depictions of trauma, guilt, and cognitive fragmentation in modern storytelling, when memory defies reality. Trauma, in clinical psychology, is defined not merely by an event, but by the persistence of its emotional impact. It is the invasion of the past into the present, the refusal of memory to obey time. In Steins' Gate, this definition becomes literal. As Okabe jumps from one world line to another, his consciousness retains memories that no longer correspond to the reality around him. Others forget, he remembers. This makes him the sole custodian of invisible histories, a man haunted by worlds that have ceased to exist. Each timeline that collapses becomes a graveyard of experiences that persist only in his mind. This phenomenon aligns with what trauma researchers call temporal dislocation, the breakdown of chronological continuity in memory. In post-traumatic states, the brain fails to integrate the traumatic experience into the narrative of life. The past remains alive, ever present, ever repeating. For Okabe, every demail and time leap amplifies this condition. He does not simply recall trauma, he relives it endlessly. Thus, Steins' Gate externalizes the psychological experience of trauma into a metaphysical structure. The world lines themselves are symbolic representations of traumatic memory, parallel realities of what might have been, each demanding emotional reconciliation that can never be achieved. Dissociation and the fragmented self. Okabe's role as the sole bearer of multiple timelines transforms him into a fragmented self, an individual whose identity dissolves under the weight of incompatible memories. This state resembles dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism that emerges when consciousness cannot reconcile contradictory experiences. In the early episodes, Okabe's eccentric persona, Huin Kyuma, functions as a coping mechanism. It is his attempt to create a coherent narrative around chaos, to maintain stability through theatrical delusion. The mad scientist persona offers him distance from emotional pain. Yet, as the tragedies compound, this constructed identity crumbles. The mask no longer protects him, it isolates him further. From a psychoanalytic perspective, this progression mirrors the process of ego collapse. When confronted with experiences that exceed comprehension, such as repeated deaths, altered realities, and moral paradoxes, the self fractures to preserve what remains of its integrity. The cost is authenticity. Okabe's laughter turns hollow. His irony becomes defensive despair. The very persona that once gave him control becomes a symptom of his disintegration. Temporal PTSD. If one were to diagnose Okabe's condition in psychological terms, it would resemble an unprecedented form of post-traumatic stress disorder, one not bound by time. In traditional PTSD, trauma arises from a single catastrophic event. In Okabe's case, trauma multiplies through repetition. Each timeline becomes another instance of loss, amplifying rather than resolving his grief. His flashbacks, the vivid reliving of Mayuri's death, the sound of the clock, the helplessness of failure exhibit textbook symptoms of PTSD, but in Steins' Gate, these symptoms gain metaphysical significance. The trauma is not confined to memory, it contaminates reality itself. Every jump in time becomes a reenactment of helplessness, an affirmation of the futility of intervention. This cyclical structure transforms the narrative into what trauma theorist Kathy Carrot calls the crisis of witnessing. Okabe is trapped between two impossibilities. To forget would be betrayal, but to remember is torment. Thus he becomes the perfect embodiment of trauma's paradox, the victim who cannot escape remembrance because remembrance defines his existence. The burden of omniscience. Knowledge in Steins' Gate is a form of suffering. Okabe's unique ability to retain memories across world lines grants him omniscience without omnipotence. He knows what others cannot, but he cannot act without consequence. This produces an unbearable psychological condition, moral paralysis. In moral psychology, this corresponds to the burden of impossible responsibility, the realization that every action, however well-intentioned, generates harm elsewhere. Okabe's repeated failures to prevent Mayuri's death lead to moral fatigue, a condition resembling compassion burnout, where empathy becomes self-destructive. This fatigue is compounded by anticipatory grief, the foreknowledge of inevitable loss. Unlike most forms of grief which follow loss, Okabe's occurs in anticipation of it, knowing he will fail, but compelled to try regardless. His existence becomes a cycle of foreseen tragedy, a perfect metaphor for the human condition. The awareness of mortality coupled with the refusal to surrender to it. Guilt as the engine of time. At the heart of Okabe's psychological torment lies guilt, the emotional residue of perceived responsibility for outcomes beyond control. In existential psychology, guilt arises not only from moral failure, but from existential freedom itself, the awareness that one's choices define the world. By manipulating time, Okabe assumes a godlike agency that magnifies this burden. Every world line he alters becomes a moral equation he cannot solve. To save one life is to sacrifice another. This mirrors the ethical tension articulated by philosophers such as Søren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre. That absolute freedom leads to absolute anxiety, for every choice becomes an act of creation. In Steins' Gate, guilt thus becomes both psychological torment and metaphysical structure. It is the emotional engine that drives Okabe's compulsion to fix reality, even as each attempt deepens his despair. The series thereby transforms guilt from a personal emotion into a cosmic force, the gravity that pulls all world lines toward tragedy. Human identity depends on the continuity of memory. We define ourselves by the stability of our past, but in Steins' Gate, this continuity collapses. As timelines diverge and converge, the concept of a singular self disintegrates. Philosopher Derek Parfit argued that personal identity is not an absolute entity, but a psychological chain of connected experiences. When this chain is disrupted, identity becomes fluid. Okabe's consciousness, stretched across multiple realities, exemplifies this fragmentation. He remembers actions he never took, relationships that no longer exist, and emotions tied to people who have died only in alternate timelines. This condition produces ontological instability, the loss of a coherent sense of being. For Okabe, reality becomes a shifting mosaic of incompatible memories. His psychological suffering thus represents not mere trauma, but a philosophical crisis. What does it mean to be oneself when time itself no longer preserves continuity? The isolation of knowledge. As Okabe's experiences accumulate, his empathy begins to collapse under the strain of isolation. Others cannot comprehend his pain because they lack his memories. This asymmetry of awareness generates a profound existential loneliness. In phenomenological terms, empathy requires intersubjectivity, shared experience between consciousnesses. But Okabe's unique perception severs this link. His suffering becomes invisible, his reality incommunicable. This is a recurring theme in existential literature, the isolation of the one who knows too much. Knowledge, stripped of communal understanding, becomes alienation. Thus, Steins' Gate redefines tragedy not as loss, but as epistemic solitude, the inability to be understood. In the language of psychology, this aligns with complicated grief, where the mourner cannot process loss due to lack of validation or shared experience. In Okabe's case, this is multiplied infinitely. He mourns worlds that never were, and no one can mourn them with him. Okabe's repeated attempts to alter time illustrate a psychological phenomenon known as repetition compulsion, introduced by Sigmund Freud. This refers to the unconscious drive to relive traumatic experiences in the hope of mastering them. Okabe's endless cycles of intervention follow this pattern precisely. Each failure to save Mayuri reinforces his trauma, yet compels him to try again. His scientific rationality becomes indistinguishable from psychological obsession. What he interprets as problem-solving is, in fact, an act of compulsion, the mind's futile attempt to rewrite an unbearable memory. Freud suggested that repetition compulsion is the psyche's effort to gain mastery over helplessness. In Steins' gate, this manifests as Okabe's refusal to accept Mayuri's death, his need to transform helplessness into control. Yet the more he resists, the more helpless he becomes. His journey thus illustrates the paradox of trauma recovery. Healing begins not with control but with acceptance. The paradox of sacrifice. The emotional climax of Okabe's journey emerges when he must choose between saving Mayuri or Kurisu. This dilemma exposes the psychological paradox of love within temporal manipulation. To love is to wish to protect, but when love is armed with absolute power, it becomes destructive. Okabe's willingness to sacrifice one beloved for another reflects the unbearable moral arithmetic of attachment. In trying to save both, he violates the moral order of time, creating suffering across realities. This conflict transforms love from salvation into burden. Psychologically, this represents the impossibility of perfect empathy. To fully alleviate another's suffering, one must often inflict pain elsewhere, even upon oneself. Okabe's torment arises from realizing that compassion cannot coexist with omnipotence. His eventual choice to let go, to accept imperfection, becomes not an act of defeat but of moral maturity. Acceptance does not erase pain, it transforms its meaning. By accepting that he cannot save everyone, Okabe restores coherence to his fractured self. His memories of countless world lines cease to be burdens and become insights, the foundation of wisdom. This resolution reflects Viktor Frankl's principle of tragic optimism, the ability to find meaning within suffering. Okabe cannot undo the past, but he can choose how to live with it. In doing so, he demonstrates the psychological evolution from obsession to understanding, from guilt to peace. The psychological cost of changing time in Steins' gate is the cost of confronting human limitation. Okabe's descent into trauma, dissociation, and guilt mirrors the emotional consequence of refusing to accept the irreversible. His suffering is not punishment for curiosity, but the inevitable result of confusing control with healing. Through his journey, Steins' gate reveals that the true horror of time travel is not paradox or physics, but psychology, the shattering of continuity, identity, and empathy. Yet within that destruction lies rebirth. The discovery that acceptance, not alteration, is the only path to peace. Okabe's evolution from manipulator of time to reconciler of reality marks one of the most profound psychological transformations in anime history. A metaphor for the universal human journey from denial to acceptance, from guilt to grace, the butterfly effect, and the collapse of meaning. One of Steins' gate's most brilliant thematic constructs lies in its embodiment of the butterfly effect, the principle that small variations in initial conditions can lead to vast and unpredictable consequences. Originating in chaos theory, the butterfly effect suggests that reality operates as a sensitive, interconnected web, where one minor alteration in the past can completely reshape the future. In most science fiction, this idea serves as narrative spectacle, a device for thrill and paradox. In Steins' gate, it becomes something deeper, a psychological and philosophical revelation. It becomes a metaphor for the fragility of human intention and the hubris of assuming control over destiny. Through its intricate plot of demails, time leaps, and world line shifts, the series invites viewers to contemplate a terrifying but liberating truth: nothing exists in isolation, and no action is ever small. Every decision, word, and impulse radiates through the web of time, producing consequences beyond comprehension. The butterfly as symbol from chaos theory to existential philosophy. The butterfly in chaos theory, flapping its wings in Brazil and causing a tornado in Texas, serves as a poetic metaphor for sensitivity to initial conditions. In Steins' gate, this concept evolves from scientific observation into existential reflection. When Okabe first sends a demail, the act appears trivial, a mere experiment. Yet, this message to the past triggers a chain of transformations that reconfigure the entire world line. The anime thus transforms the butterfly into a symbol of moral causality. Every alteration becomes a form of moral authorship. To change time is to write new laws of cause and effect, laws whose consequences one cannot foresee or control. In this sense, Steins' gate critiques not only scientific ambition but also existential arrogance, our tendency to act as though knowledge guarantees wisdom. By showing how even the smallest act of intervention unravels meaning, the series reveals a universal paradox that understanding how the world works does not grant mastery over its moral or emotional consequences. The collapse of meaning when causality becomes chaos. In the ordinary world, meaning depends on stability. We interpret our lives as sequences of causes and effects that align with moral intuition. Effort leads to reward, kindness leads to trust, choice leads to identity. But when causality collapses, meaning follows. In Steins' gate, every world line represents a different moral universe. In one, friendship thrives; in another, betrayal reigns; in yet another, death is inevitable. No singular version of reality holds primacy. This destabilizes the moral fabric of existence. If every possibility exists, then no outcome is final, and meaning itself becomes provisional. This is the existential void at the heart of Steins Gate. When every possible choice is realized in some timeline, the distinction between right and wrong dissolves. Okabe's suffering arises from precisely this realization. His moral compass, once guided by love and loyalty, becomes fragmented under the weight of infinite causality. Every act of compassion creates suffering elsewhere. Every attempt to fix pain multiplies it. Philosophically, this echoes Albert Camus' concept of the absurd, the confrontation between human desire for coherence and the universe's indifference to it. In Steins' Gate, the universe is not malevolent, but indifferent. It allows everything and forgives nothing. The tragedy of Okabe lies in his attempt to impose moral order upon a system that transcends morality itself. Consequence: chaos theory posits that complex systems are deterministic yet unpredictable. That is, they follow laws, but those laws generate results so sensitive to initial conditions that prediction becomes impossible. This principle serves as both scientific metaphor and psychological truth within Steins Gate. Human emotions and decisions mirror chaotic systems. Love, fear, guilt, and ambition are governed by laws of mind and circumstance, yet their outcomes defy prediction. When Okabe alters the past, he does not act irrationally, he acts humanly. His choices follow from compassion and guilt, both deeply lawful emotions. Yet the outcomes they produce belong to chaos, not control. In this sense, Steins' Gate uses the language of science to reveal a moral truth. Even the most rational decision can yield irrational results because human life, like the weather, operates at the edge of chaos. Kabe's journey then becomes a dramatization of moral entropy, the gradual loss of coherence in the face of complexity. Each D-mail he sends introduces noise into the moral system of his world. Eventually, that system collapses. Meaning becomes statistical, not moral. The future becomes a function of chance, not intention. The narrative structure of Steins' Gate itself enacts the butterfly effect. The story does not flow linearly but fractally, each episode spiraling into altered versions of previous events. Viewers experience causality as Okabe does through discontinuity and déjà vu. This structure destabilizes narrative expectation, mirroring the chaos of time itself. Traditional storytelling offers comfort through causality in the belief that events lead logically to outcomes. Steins' Gate dismantles this comfort. By fracturing causality, it forces the audience to experience the anxiety of a world without stable meaning. This meta-narrative design serves a dual function. First, it aligns form with content. The disorientation of the viewer reflects the disorientation of the protagonist. Second, it challenges the philosophical assumption that stories, like lives, must make sense. In Steins' Gate, coherence is not given, it must be chosen. Meaning becomes an act of creation, not discovery. Thus, the series becomes a meta-commentary on narrative itself. To seek control over time is to seek control over story, to rewrite one's past into coherence. But as Okabe learns, true meaning arises not from rewriting but from accepting the story as it is told. Beyond its philosophical implications, the butterfly effect in Steins' Gate explores the emotional truth of human interconnectedness. Every character's desire, fear, and decision resonates across the network of world lines, showing how intimacy magnifies consequence. Kurisu's scientific pragmatism, Mayuri's innocence, Suzuha's desperation each influences the flow of time. The series thereby humanizes chaos theory, illustrating that every person is both cause and effect, both butterfly and storm. This interconnectedness reveals the futility of isolationist morality. No one acts alone, no choice is private. The D-mails become metaphors for emotional communication messages we send into the past, hoping to change how others remember us. Like real relationships, they generate unpredictable responses. The more we try to control how others feel, the more unintended pain we cause. Thus, the butterfly effect becomes not just a scientific principle, but a psychological truth. To love is to lose control. The series suggests that genuine connection requires surrender to unpredictability, the willingness to accept outcomes beyond intention. The butterfly and the human condition. At its most profound level, Steins' Gate uses the butterfly effect to articulate a vision of the human condition, fragile, interdependent, and defined by unintended consequences. Our lives, like world lines, are entangled systems of influence and reaction. A word of kindness may echo across decades, a careless act may ripple through generations. The series reminds us that human existence is a network of unseen connections where the smallest gesture can alter destinies. Yet rather than inspiring fear, this truth invites humility. If control is impossible, then the only moral path is compassion without possession, to act with care, knowing that results may elude us. In this light, Okabe's eventual choice to accept the Steins' Gate world line, a timeline of compromise, balance, and acceptance, becomes symbolic of maturity itself. It represents the shift from the illusion of control to the wisdom of coexistence with uncertainty. The butterfly effect in Steins' Gate is not merely scientific spectacle, but existential revelation. It exposes the fragility of intention, the interconnectedness of lives, and the futility of absolute control. Through its chaotic moral landscape, the series teaches that every action is both creation and destruction, that meaning cannot be engineered but must be lived. Okabe's journey through collapsing timelines mirrors humanity's collective struggle, with consequence our desire to change the past, our fear of making it worse, and our slow awakening to the wisdom of acceptance. By transforming chaos into metaphor, Steins.gate offers a profound philosophical truth: the only way to master time is to stop fighting it. The illusion of free will. At its core, Steins.gate is a confrontation between two of humanity's oldest philosophical questions. Is fate predetermined? If so, do our choices hold meaning? The anime's answer, like the most profound works of philosophy, is paradoxical. Both fate and freedom exist, but only within the context of one another. Fate defines the structure, freedom defines the experience within it. Through Okabe Rintaro's journey, Steins.gate constructs a universe in which every act of resistance against destiny paradoxically fulfills it. Every attempt to escape a predetermined future reinforces its inevitability. Yet within this cruel symmetry, there emerges a subtle, redemptive truth. Even if outcomes are fixed, how one confronts them remains a realm of authentic freedom. Thus, Steins.gate becomes not just a story about time travel, but a meditation on the existential tension between determinism and agency, a modern retelling of humanity's struggle to find meaning in a governed universe. The deterministic universe, the alpha and beta world lines. Within the cosmology of Steins.gate, the alpha and beta world lines represent determinism made manifest. No matter how many demails or time leaps Okabe sends, certain events remain inescapable: Mayuri's death in the beta world line and Kurisu's death in the alpha world line. This repetition establishes what might be termed ontological fatalism, the principle that certain events are invariant across all possible timelines. It is not that the universe conspires against human will, but that it operates according to deeper structural necessities, causal attractors that cannot be escaped. In this sense, the world lines mirror the ancient Greek conception of Moira fate, the cosmic order that even gods cannot override. Fate in Steins' gate is not moral punishment, it is metaphysical law. To violate it is not sin, but futility. This metaphysical constraint transforms Okabe into a tragic hero in the classical sense. Like Oedipus, his downfall is not born of malice or ignorance, but of knowledge itself, the awareness that choice cannot alter destiny, only reveal it. The illusion of choice, time travel as existential mirror. From a psychological and philosophical standpoint, the act of time travel in Steins.gate exposes the illusion of choice. When Okabe leaps backward to alter events, he exercises what appears to be free will. Yet every change he makes only leads him toward the same inevitable outcomes. This aligns closely with the concept of compatibilism in philosophy, the idea that determinism and free will are not mutually exclusive. Humans may act freely, but their freedom operates within the boundaries of necessity. Okabe's decisions are genuine, but the outcomes are constrained by the universe's structure. This dynamic reveals the cruel beauty of human existence. Freedom exists not in altering outcomes, but in assigning meaning to them. We may not control fate, but we control interpretation. In Okabe's case, this realization marks his transformation from scientist to philosopher, from one who manipulates reality to one who understands it. The human need for control and the conflict between fate and free will in Steins.gate exposes a universal psychological truth: humans crave control, even when it is impossible. This craving is both our greatest strength and our deepest vulnerability. In evolutionary psychology, the illusion of control serves adaptive purposes. It motivates persistence, creativity, and survival. Yet, when that illusion collapses, as it does for Okabe, the psyche faces existential crisis. His despair mirrors humanity's confrontation with randomness. If effort cannot guarantee outcome, what justifies action? The answer, Steins.gate suggests, lies not in control, but in authenticity. Meaning is not derived from success, but from sincerity, from choosing to act despite futility. This echoes Viktor Frankl's existential psychology: one's freedom lies in choosing one's attitude toward necessity. Okabe's repeated failures thus serve as spiritual purification. Through suffering, he transcends the need for control and rediscovers purpose as acceptance. His scientific curiosity evolves into moral courage. The eternal return, Nietzsche's challenge in time. One of the deeper philosophical undercurrents of Steins.gate is the concept of eternal recurrence. Articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea that life repeats infinitely, and the highest form of affirmation is to will that repetition. Okabe, forced to relive countless variations of the same events, experiences a literal form of eternal return. The psychological question becomes, can one love a life that must be lived again and again with all its pain intact? Initially, Okabe rejects this idea. He seeks escape, a single perfect timeline free of suffering, but his journey teaches him Nietzsche's lesson, meaning arises not from the elimination of pain, but from the acceptance of it. To live authentically is to affirm existence, including its tragedies. By the time he reaches the Steins.gate world line, Okabe no longer seeks to erase pain. He embraces it as the proof of love, memory, and purpose. In doing so, he embodies Nietzsche's yes-sayer, the one who, even knowing the suffering of life, chooses it again willingly. Kurisu Makise functions as the intellectual counterpoint to Okabe's emotional struggle. Her scientific worldview represents rational determinism, the belief that reality obeys consistent laws regardless of desire. Her initial skepticism toward time travel reflects scientific humility, yet as she becomes emotionally entangled with Okabe, her philosophy evolves. She begins to acknowledge that understanding law does not equate to understanding life. Her affection for Okabe becomes an anomaly, a variable her equations cannot predict. In this way, Kurisu symbolizes the intersection between logic and emotion, determinism and freedom. She embodies the modern scientific spirit confronted by the ancient existential dilemma: even if the universe is lawful, the experience of love, grief, and choice remains irreducibly human. Her death and Okabe's agony in its wake crystallize this truth. Determinism may govern outcomes, but it cannot extinguish the subjective intensity of feeling. Freedom in the existential sense survives within the heart, even when the cosmos is mechanical. Mayuri and the innocence of acceptance. If Kurisu represents rational determinism, Mayuri represents existential acceptance. Her character, often dismissed as naive, embodies the wisdom of non-resistance. She accepts life's flow without demanding control. Mayuri's recurring death functions as the universe's reminder of mortality, the one variable that cannot be altered. Her calm demeanor, even in tragedy, stands in philosophical contrast to Okabe's frantic interventions. Where Okabe fights time, Mayuri lives within it. In this sense, she represents the Buddhist principle of anicca, impermanence, and the psychological freedom that arises from embracing it. Her presence in the narrative serves as emotional equilibrium, reminding Okabe and the viewer that peace is not found in power, but in acceptance. Through Mayuri Steins gate two forms of wisdom, Kurisu's intellectual humility and Mayuri's emotional serenity. Both converge in Okabe's final realization that the highest form of intelligence is acceptance guided by love. The philosophy of Steins gate lies in its reconciliation of opposites: freedom within fate, knowledge within ignorance, peace within chaos. Through Okabe's journey, the anime constructs a moral universe where the pursuit of control gives way to the grace of acceptance. Fate, once an antagonist, becomes a teacher. The illusion of free will becomes truth through awareness. And in that awareness, humanity discovers its most profound form of meaning, the courage to act even when outcomes are uncertain. Okabe's final smile in the Steins Gate world line is not victory, but transcendence. It signifies the transformation of despair into understanding and of control into wisdom. In a universe governed by laws beyond comprehension, Steins Gate reminds us of one timeless truth: freedom is not the power to change the past, it is the strength to accept it. The psychology of Okabe Rintaro, between genius and delusion. Among the pantheon of anime protagonists, few embody the tension between intellect and madness as profoundly as Okabe Rintaro. To casual viewers, he may appear as a caricature, a self-proclaimed mad scientist draped in theatrical eccentricity. Yet beneath the surface lies a character study of rare psychological depth. Steins Gate constructs Okabe not merely as a person, but as a living paradox, a man whose brilliance conceals fragility, whose delusion masks trauma, and whose journey through time reflects the universal struggle between control and acceptance. Okabe's character arc, spanning the full breadth of the narrative, is a psychological odyssey from denial to awareness. His evolution mirrors the transition from neurosis to existential acceptance, from a fractured self-image built on fantasy to an integrated identity rooted in truth. Through Okabe, Steins Gate dramatizes the cost of intelligence untempered by emotional maturity, the dangers of detachment in the face of pain, and the necessity of humility in confronting the limits of human understanding. The mad scientist persona. The defining feature of Okabe's character is his alter ego, Houun Kyuma. At first glance, this persona appears to be a manifestation of adolescent delusion, a comic exaggeration of scientific grandeur. Yet, upon closer examination, it functions as a defense mechanism, a psychological structure designed to protect a fragile ego from emotional collapse. In psychoanalytic terms, Okabe's behavior can be read as a form of reaction formation, a process in which an individual adopts exaggerated attitudes or behaviors opposite to their internal fears. His bombastic confidence, flamboyant gestures, and paranoid fantasies of secret organizations conceal a deep insecurity about his worth and purpose. By performing madness, he maintains the illusion of control over a chaotic world. This act also reflects what existential psychologists describe as the mask of absurdity, a response to meaninglessness through theatricality. Faced with the void, the realization that life lacks inherent order, some individuals adopt exaggerated roles to impose structure on the chaos. Okabe's mad scientist, identity Steins Gate refuses to romanticize or condemn madness. Instead, it portrays it as an adaptive mechanism, a necessary madness in an unbearable world. Intelligence as isolation. Okabe's intellect, though celebrated, is also his greatest source of alienation. The anime subtly presents intelligence not as a gift, but as a burden that isolates him from others. His understanding of science and causality places him in a cognitive realm inaccessible to most, generating both superiority and loneliness. Psychologically, this is consistent with the phenomenon of intellectual overcompensation when individuals rely on intellect to avoid confronting emotions they cannot process. For Okabe, scientific reasoning becomes a substitute for intimacy. He dissects reality as though it were an equation, distancing himself from the unpredictable messiness of human emotion. However, when the consequences of his experiments manifest when Mayuri dies repeatedly, and Kurisu's life becomes the cost of stability, his rationalism collapses. Logic, once his refuge, becomes impotent in the face of moral suffering. This transition marks the psychological crux of his development, the realization that intelligence, without empathy, becomes a tool of destruction. In philosophical terms, Okabe embodies the tragedy of the Enlightenment mind. He represents the rationalist who discovers the limits of reason, a thinker who, in seeking mastery over nature, confronts the abyss of his own impotence. His suffering thus echoes the lament of modern humanity, that knowledge expands faster than wisdom, and power grows faster than moral understanding. The role of delusion in survival. Okabe's descent into delusion is not merely a symptom of madness, but a survival mechanism. When confronted with unbearable trauma, the psyche often constructs alternate realities to preserve coherence. For Okabe, the persistence of his mad scientist persona serves precisely this purpose. His eccentric behavior allows him to maintain a sense of agency even as the laws of reality collapse around him. This phenomenon parallels what psychiatrists call adaptive dissociation, the mind's ability to detach from reality as a means of self-protection. By framing his suffering within the mythology of conspiracies and cosmic significance, Okabe transforms his helplessness into purpose. He becomes not a victim of fate, but its challenger. Yet, as the narrative progresses, the line between coping mechanism and pathology begins to blur. His delusion, once empowering, becomes imprisoning. When confronted with the irreversible nature of his actions, the fantasy can no longer sustain him. The disintegration of the Huinkuma persona thus symbolizes the collapse of denial and the emergence of genuine self-awareness. The anime treats this transformation with remarkable psychological realism. Okabe's eventual breakdown, his tears, exhaustion, and silence are not signs of weakness, but of healing. In trauma recovery, the collapse of protective delusions is often the first step toward integration. By relinquishing his fantasy, he becomes capable of confronting the world as it is, rather than as he wishes it to be. The burden of memory. One of the most striking aspects of Okabe's psychology is his unique relationship with memory. In the world of Steins Gate, he alone retains awareness of changes across timelines, a gift that quickly becomes a curse. His mind becomes a repository of realities that coexist only within his consciousness. This phenomenon mirrors the experience of survivors' guilt and traumatic recall. Just as trauma survivors are haunted by memories others cannot comprehend, Okabe is burdened by knowledge of worlds that no longer exist. His inability to share this burden isolates him from those he loves. To them, he appears eccentric or insane. To him, they are ghosts of lost realities. From a neurological perspective, Okabe's condition can be likened to hyperthymesia, the ability to remember every detail of one's life, but on an existential scale. Such memory, rather than a gift, becomes torture, as it prevents the mind from healing through forgetting. His constant recollection of alternate timelines creates a fractured continuity of identity, leading to dissociation and emotional exhaustion. Philosophically, Okabe's burden symbolizes the cost of consciousness itself. To be aware is to suffer. The more he understands the consequences of his actions, the less capable he becomes of living freely. Steins Gate thereby suggests that ignorance in certain contexts may be a form of mercy, that absolute awareness, though idealized, can be psychologically devastating. Okabe as a mirror of the viewer. Ultimately, Okabe functions as a mirror for the audience. His struggle encapsulates the modern condition, the tension between technological mastery and emotional fragility. In a world increasingly dominated by control of data, time, and information, Okabe's suffering warns of the psychological cost of omnipotence. Viewers recognize themselves in his contradictions, the desire to change the past, the fear of loss, the guilt of unintended harm. His story thus becomes universal, transforming personal tragedy into philosophical reflection. In him, we see our own futile attempts to rewrite regret, to impose meaning upon the indifferent flow of time. By confronting us with Okabe's despair, Steins Gate invites us to reconsider our relationship with control. It asks whether progress, in its endless pursuit of mastery, blinds us to the necessity of limitation. Okabe's final act to embrace uncertainty becomes a model for living authentically within imperfection. Okabe Rintaro is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is a man torn between intellect and emotion, trapped between delusion and clarity. His brilliance isolates him, his trauma fragments him, and his love redeems him. Through him, Steins Gate constructs a psychological allegory of the human condition, the endless struggle to find meaning in a world that resists comprehension. In the end, his madness was never a defect, but a form of courage. It allowed him to confront truths that ordinary minds could not bear. His journey teaches that wisdom does not arise from mastery over time, but from reconciliation with it. To be human, Steins Gate reminds us, is to suffer, to err, and finally to accept why Steins Gate is a must-watch. Steins.gate is more than a narrative about time travel. It is a profound exploration of the human condition. Through the intricate interplay of causality, memory, emotion, and identity, the series illuminates the fragile beauty of existence, demonstrating that attempts to control reality are inevitably tempered by consequence. It stands as a testament to the idea that the human struggle is not to master the universe, but to navigate its uncertainties with courage, empathy, and wisdom. At its core, Steins.gate teaches that the desire to alter the past, however well-intentioned, carries inherent danger. Okabe's repeated interventions in the timeline reveal the devastating consequences of even minor changes. Through the lens of the butterfly effect, the series illustrates the profound interconnectedness of all actions, emphasizing that life's seemingly small events ripple outward, shaping futures in ways beyond comprehension. This is not merely a cautionary tale about science, it is a philosophical meditation on the limits of human agency. The characters themselves embody the spectrum of psychological and moral insight. Okabe Rintaro's eccentricity, trauma, and eventual acceptance offer a deep exploration of the human psyche under extraordinary conditions. Kurisuma Kisei's brilliance and ethical awareness highlight the balance between intellect and empathy, demonstrating that true knowledge carries both power and moral responsibility. Mayuri Shina embodies innocence and emotional grounding, reminding us of the stabilizing importance of love, friendship, and relational identity in a chaotic world. Memory, loss, and identity operate as the series' emotional and philosophical backbone. The persistence of Okabe's consciousness across altered world lines reflects the fragility and resilience of the human mind. The narrative shows that identity is not solely defined by objective events, but by the integration of memory, moral choice, and relational engagement. Steins.gate teaches that suffering, while inevitable, is essential for growth, empathy, and authentic agency. The philosophical lessons extend beyond psychology into the realm of existential thought. The series interrogates determinism, free will, and the ethical consequences of knowledge. It illustrates that perfection is unattainable, that every intervention entails moral responsibility, and that acceptance of life's limitations is itself a form of wisdom. Okabe's journey demonstrates that courage lies not in mastery, but in endurance, in embracing uncertainty while acting with integrity. Finally, what makes Steins.gate a must-watch is the seamless fusion of science, philosophy, and human emotion. It challenges viewers to reflect on their own lives. How would we act if given the power to rewrite the past? Could we bear the consequences of our choices? The series posits that the most profound lessons come not from control, but from recognition of our limitations, from empathy, and from the courage to accept life as it unfolds. In conclusion, Steins.gate stands as a masterpiece of narrative and thought, a rare anime that engages intellect and heart in equal measure. Its brilliance lies in showing that life's fragility, its unpredictability, and its inevitable loss are not flaws to be corrected, but realities to be embraced. By witnessing Okabe's journey through despair, insight, love, and acceptance, viewers confront fundamental truths about humanity: that meaning is forged through experience, that responsibility accompanies knowledge, and that true strength emerges from accepting the world as it is, rather than as we wish it to be. In a culture often obsessed with control and perfection, Steins.gate reminds us that the human experience is defined not by mastery over events, but by the grace and courage with which we navigate them. Its narrative is a call to empathy, reflection, and philosophical contemplation, and in doing so, it secures its place not only as a must-watch anime, but as a work of enduring intellectual and emotional significance. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below.